The atmosphere around Golden State had changed, even if no one wanted to admit it out loud. It wasn't just the smaller number of people in the stands, nor the strange silence that took over the arena at certain moments of the game. It was the kind of feeling you can't quite explain, but you feel it in your chest. Something big was about to happen. Something that could seal not only the fate of the season, but perhaps the end, or the reinvention, of an entire era. The team that once seemed to toy with the league, that turned three-point shots into a weapon of mass destruction, was now showing signs of wear. Heavy decisions being made behind the scenes, injuries constantly disrupting the rotation, a chemistry that no longer felt as spontaneous as before. The spark was still there, shining brightly in the eyes of their great leader on the court. But the world around him had changed. Opponents had learned, adapted, grown, and Golden State suddenly seemed to be chasing instead of dictating the pace. The numbers laid the discomfort bare. Half the games won, half lost. A balance that, in practice, was the portrait of instability. A roster with talent to spare, but that rarely functioned like a well-synchronized machine. Games in which the offense flowed, but the defense fell apart. Nights when the defense showed up, but the attack stalled. Instead of confidence, questions appeared. Instead of natural flow, there was the feeling of exaggerated effort just to make the simple things work. And there was a silent enemy lurking around the locker room. Health, bodies more worn down, minutes being managed, constant treatments, the permanent worry of, what if he gets hurt again? That doesn't just hit the physical. It eats away at confidence. It opens invisible wounds that touch ego, pride, self-esteem. And when that happens, the whole system feels it. Given this scenario, a conclusion began to impose itself within the front office. The waiting period was over. They could no longer push decisions into the future. The years left with the franchise's greatest icons still at a high level are finite, and wasting them would be almost a sporting crime. It wasn't just about fighting for wins. It was about ensuring that, while this star still shone, the team around him was up to the task tactically, emotionally, and mentally. In this context of urgency, one name began to circulate intensely behind the scenes: Domantas Sabonis. The center from the Californian rival was seen by many as the ready-made answer to several problems at once: strength in the paint, exceptional court vision, creative passing, consistent offensive presence, strong rebounding. In theory, he seemed like the perfect fit to relieve pressure on the perimeter and add a new layer to the offensive system. A player capable of stitching plays together, organizing the attack from the inside out and serving as an anchor in the middle of the lane. More than that, rumors indicated that Sacramento were willing to listen to offers for practically any piece on the roster, as long as the proposal was tempting enough. That set off an alarm across the league, but especially in Golden State, because suddenly people weren't just talking about a potential reinforcement. They were talking about a move capable of redefining the direction of two franchises at the same time. However, as soon as the idea gained strength, the first doubts surfaced. And they weren't doubts about Sabonis' talent. No one questioned that. The issue was something else. Is he really the type of center this team needs? Would he solve more problems than he creates? Analysts began to dissect the scenario. On one side were the arguments in favor: a player who generates points even without shooting much from three, who reads the opposing defense well, who moves the ball quickly, who makes his teammates better. Imagine him receiving the ball at the top of the key, distributing passes to cutters, screens, constant movement. In a team that has always valued intelligence and off-ball motion, that is seductive. On the other side, though, was the part that sends chills down the spine of any coaching staff: the defensive impact. Golden State had already been struggling to protect the rim and control the boards on nights against more physical teams. Adding a center who is a great creator but not exactly an intimidator in the paint could be a risky swap. Yes, he helps on the glass. But can he really turn the painted area into a no-go zone for opponents? Or would it remain vulnerable in schemes that demand quick switches and constant help rotations? And that is where the most delicate point comes in: the fit with the team's main references. How would a lineup with Sabonis sharing the floor with Draymond Green and Stephen Curry work? Would the spacing be suffocated or fluid? Would the paint be too crowded, pulling the defense inside and making life harder for those who live off long-range shots? Who would cover the defensive gaps when the team was already struggling to maintain consistency on that end? One commentator summed up the dilemma in a sentence that circulated widely among executives and fans. "He is too good to ignore, but maybe not exactly what you're looking for when you try to fix your biggest flaws." In other words, Sabonis would certainly raise the level in some aspects, but leave open wounds the team had already been trying to close. And with 2 years remaining on a heavy contract, taking that risk would mean tying the franchise to a bet that might not be ideal. The concern, then, stopped being just tactical. It became strategic. Every general manager fears the same nightmare, compromising the team's future with a move that limits flexibility and prevents later corrections, especially when dealing with a short window around a great star. Even so, the conversation didn't die. And the reason is simple. There were few alternatives. The front court no longer had the same solidity of other times. Injuries in key positions exposed the fragility of the big man rotation. Young players who were supposed to take on more responsibility were still inconsistent. And while half the league was still trying to decide whether to buy or sell at the deadline, Golden State felt the weight of urgency knocking at the door. That is where the name of Jonathan Kuminga returned to the eye of the storm. Sacramento had always looked at him with interest. A young wing, explosive, athletic, capable of attacking the rim, running the floor, and guarding multiple positions. For a franchise seeking energy and renewal, that profile is pure gold. But on Golden State's side, the situation was much more complex. Kuminga carried the label of future pillar, but also of question mark. Recent injuries had disrupted his rhythm. Inconsistent minutes on the court fed frustration, and the coach's public comments about defensive commitment, decision-making, and tactical discipline created a noise that was hard to ignore. A young player with a very high ceiling, but on a path that would require something the team might no longer have in abundance: time, patience, and freedom to make mistakes. Worse, the league's clock doesn't stop. While the veteran star keeps producing, every season that passes without a clear plan for both present and future feels like a waste. Internally, an uncomfortable question emerged. Is the best way to maximize what remains of this prime to bet on what Kuminga might become in 3 years, or to trade that potential for someone who helps immediately, even with obvious risks? At that point, other names entered the equation. Moses Moody, for instance. Far less media hype than some of his teammates, but extremely respected by those who follow the team's daily routine closely. A disciplined player, with good feel for the game, reliable on both ends of the floor, with a professional mindset that pleases any coach. Taking Moody out of the roster would mean giving up stability, the kind of piece that may not make front pages, but holds the system together in turbulent moments. And then Buddy Hield appears in the conversation. A specialist from long range, capable of igniting games with a quick flurry of threes. Someone who, in theory, fits very well in any system that values spacing and offensive volume. For Sacramento, he is an important asset within the current structure. In a trade package, he could be the piece that balances salaries and adds immediate firepower to the other side. The rumor that spread strongly in the corridors was precisely this: a package involving Kuminga, Moody, and Buddy Hield in exchange for Domantas Sabonis and Keon Ellis. On one side, youth, versatility, and shooting. On the other, an all-star center and a perimeter player with the potential to grow in a structured environment. It is the kind of proposal that changes futures. Golden State would gain a consolidated presence in the paint, someone to centralize part of the offensive creation and ease the burden on its main star. In return, it would give up 2 rising prospects and one of the most dangerous shooters in the league. Youth and flexibility out, experience and structure in. At least that was the enticing picture painted by the trade's supporters. Except basketball doesn't stop at the drawing board. On the human side, the tension was palpable. It was enough to watch practice. Players looking around, silently wondering who would still be on the roster a few weeks from now. Young guys trying to prove their worth every session, as if every shot, every cut, every play were a final exam. Veterans observing everything with a mix of calm and concern, understanding that decisions like this can redefine not only the team, but their own careers. In the midst of it all, the figure of the team's big star took on a different layer. He was still the compass, the one who calms the room with a single look, who takes responsibility in critical moments, who sets the tone even when the scoreboard doesn't help. But there was something new in the way he carried himself. Less euphoria, more contemplation, as if each game, each season, each trade rumor were reminding him that the countdown is real, and it is exactly this countdown that turns any trade talk into something almost existential for the franchise. Because it's not just about answering whether Sabonis is good or not. The real question is, what does Golden State want to be from now on? A team willing to give up an important part of its future for a chance to maximize the present? Or an organization that takes a deep breath, accepts the possibility of a few more turbulent years, and decides to rebuild its identity calmly, without betraying the style that made it unique? Inside the front office, some voices began to push the discussion to another level. Is the real issue just who comes in and who goes out? Or is the bigger challenge to rediscover the essence that made this team special? Because there is still talent, experience, even more so. But what about that almost magical synchronicity, where everyone seemed to move to the same rhythm as if they shared a single mind? Several analysts pointed to an uncomfortable reality. Over time, Golden State stopped being the surprise that dismantled unprepared defenses and became a predictable team. Still dangerous, still respected, but predictable. The same patterns, the same plays, the same type of protagonism. Bringing in Sabonis, in this context, could be a technical gain, but also reinforce a script opponents have already learned to read. That is why the Sabonis yes or no discussion grew so much. It is not just about technical fit. It is a choice of path. The center could make the offense even smarter, but less unpredictable. And for a team that built its legacy precisely on the ability to break patterns, that might be the real risk. While the conversations were heating up in the offices, the locker room felt the effects without needing to hear details. Kuminga became the involuntary center of many talks. One day he shone, dunked over the entire defense, defended well, showed flashes of someone who could be the next face of the franchise. On the next, he made silly mistakes, got lost in rotations, stayed on the bench in important moments. Rumors about his relationship with the coach grew louder. Comments about focus, fit, and consistency were dissected on sports shows, social media, and roundtables. It wasn't just a tactical issue. It was emotional. There was a sense that any decision regarding Kuminga could, a few years from now, be remembered either as a stroke of genius or an unforgivable mistake. And that raises the pressure on everyone involved. From Sacramento's side, though, the view was much more optimistic. They saw Kuminga as a gem ready to be polished in a different context. A player who could gain more prominence, more minutes, more freedom to make mistakes and grow. A high-ceiling project capable, in a short time, of becoming one of the main names in the conference if everything went right. And, at certain moments, betting on what someone can become is far more exciting than staying tied to what is already consolidated, but perhaps has clear limits. Moody, in turn, was seen as the kind of piece every good roster needs. Someone who doesn't shy away from the dirty work, who shoots when needed, who defends the way the coach asks, who understands his role. Losing that type of player comes at a price that often only becomes evident after he is gone. And Buddy Hield entered as instant noise. If he stayed in Golden State, he could become a devastating complementary weapon alongside the team's main star, taking the perimeter volume to absurd levels on some nights. If he ended up just as a transitional piece, he would still help keep the team competitive while other moves were organized. In light of all this, one question began to hover over the front office. Is the answer really in a blockbuster trade? Or is there another path, perhaps less obvious, that involves making smaller adjustments, betting on underrated players, looking at different markets, exploring talents that haven't yet had a real chance in the NBA? It is precisely at this point in the story that another name, coming from far away from California, starts cropping up in backstage conversations. A young center on the rise on the international scene who has been racking up impressive numbers and drawing attention from analysts and fans alike. Someone who, at first glance, seems very distant from the reality of the American League, but who, the more you watch, the more he appears to fit exactly the gaps Golden State has been exposing. And that is where the discussion stops being only about millionaire contracts and starts touching on the imagination of the fan base, which has already begun to move on social media, asking for a solution that brings together future, identity, and immediate need. On the other side of the planet, far away from the NBA's behind-the-scenes debates, another storyline was being written with the same mix of pressure, expectation, and dream. While Golden State were trying to decide whether to give up part of their future for an already established star, an Asian big man was quietly putting together his own resume to cross the ocean and knock on the door of the most demanding league in the world. Kai returned to the court with a performance that didn't look like it came from someone merely promising. It looked like the work of a player ready for something bigger. In the game against Kyoto, he took center stage in a way that simply couldn't be ignored. He finished with 20 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists, but more than the cold numbers, what stood out was the way he controlled the game. He imposed himself in the paint, moved with surprising lightness for someone his size, punished any defensive lapse with precise touches near the rim, and when the defense collapsed on him, found open teammates with simple, intelligent passes. From the very first possession, you could tell he was on a different wavelength. Defenders tried to push him out of his comfort zone, but ran into something that blended physicality, skill, and feel for the game. Kai used his body well, set his feet calmly, put the ball on the floor with security, and finished without rushing, as if he had an internal metronome controlling the tempo. Every now and then, he drifted away from the basket and showed off his mid-range jumper, making it clear he wasn't just big in the literal sense, but someone who had been steadily expanding his offensive arsenal. In the tensest stretch of the game, when the lead was threatening to melt away, he called the game to himself. In a play that lit up the crowd, he received the ball near the lane, faked past 2 defenders, absorbed the contact, finished the layup, and still secured the extra point at the free throw line. That kind of sequence isn't worth just 3 points on the scoreboard. It earns respect. It carries the feeling that, when things get tight, there is someone willing to carry the weight on his back. As the season went on, his individual numbers began to approach symbolic milestones. Kai was just short of the 1,000-point mark in the B League, roughly a few dozen points that any run of good games could take care of. It wasn't just a statistical landmark, it was proof of consistency. At the same time, his rebounds had already passed the 500 mark, showing constant dominance in the paint. And with just a little more than a handful of assists separating him from the 3-digit club in that category, it was clear he wasn't out there just to finish plays, but to create them as well. Looked at together, these numbers painted a clear picture. Kai was not a one-dimensional center. He combined physical presence with understanding of the game, protected the painted area, helped initiate the offense, and on top of that, was visibly improving his shooting. Every game seemed to add a new detail to his repertoire. And in an era where everything is recorded, commented on, and shared in real time, it didn't take long for specialists to start comparing him to great big men who first appeared in leagues outside the NBA before exploding on the world stage. The inevitable question arose: where should he go when the time came to cross the ocean? Which franchise would have the courage and vision to bet on a rising, still developing talent, but one who showed clear signs that he could become something special if polished in the right environment? That was when one specific name started to be mentioned more and more often: the Golden State Warriors. For many fans, this possible union seemed to make perfect sense. On one side, a team that has been trying for years to strengthen its presence in the paint, needing someone big, mobile, and committed to team basketball. Someone who can battle for rebounds, contest shots around the rim, provide second chances on offense, and at the same time, not slow down the up-tempo style and ball movement that have always been part of the team's identity. On the other side, a young center with impressive length, used to facing different styles around the world, with a mentality that blends humility and ambition in just the right measure. Instead of chasing only an expensive, already established solution with some well-known limitations, as in the case of Sabonis, the franchise could opt for a lower-cost, higher-ceiling gamble. A player willing to learn, to absorb the culture of movement and tactical intelligence that Golden State have built over the years. Rather than trying to wedge him into a ready-made system, the team could shape parts of that system around his traits, exactly as they have done with other players in different phases of their championship era. Kai brings together attributes that do not often appear all at once. He is big enough to be an intimidating presence near the basket, but he doesn't lumber up and down the floor. He moves with purpose, knows how to position himself, understands when he should run in transition, and when he needs to slow down to organize. Offensively, he knows how to punish smaller defenders, but he doesn't rely only on that. He can pass the ball, spots his teammates' cuts, accepts being the link between the perimeter and the paint. Defensively, there are still adjustments to be made, as with any developing player, but the potential impact is obvious, especially with a solid team structure around him. One important detail in this equation is mentality. Kai doesn't play like someone satisfied with his current numbers. His attitude on and off the court gives the impression of an athlete who knows he is always a work in progress. He doesn't shrink in big moments, but he doesn't seem dazzled by his own performances either. That balance is rare. Players who dream of the NBA often carry anxiety in their eyes. In his case, what comes across is focus. It didn't take long for the Golden State fan base to turn this idea into a movement. On social media, there were requests, edits, videos, comments, campaigns, all pointing in the same direction, seeing Kai wearing the franchise's colors. Not as an instant savior, but as a smart investment, aligned with the kind of basketball the team has always stood for. A game built on reading, tempo, and unselfishness, where nobody is on the floor just to pad their stats, but to keep the whole machine running. From the front office's point of view, a move like that has some interesting layers. Instead of spending most of their flexibility on a huge, already defined contract, as would be the case in a trade for an established center, betting on Kai would allow them to shape the future with more freedom. The team could test him, develop him, and, at the same time, continue tweaking the roster around him without being tied to a long-term, multi-million commitment that might not fix their biggest issues. And there is still a dimension that many pretend to ignore, but which matters a lot: global impact. The arrival of a giant from Asia to a team with Golden State's visibility would immediately boost the fan base, international reach, and interest in distant markets. It's not just about selling shirts or increasing viewership in unusual time slots. It's about bringing cultures closer together, attracting new fans to the sport and to the franchise, and cementing an image of a team that looks beyond the obvious and isn't afraid to invest in talents who haven't followed the traditional path. In that context, the franchise's dilemma becomes even more complex. On one side, the proposal of a blockbuster trade, capable of bringing in a player who is already a proven star, like Sabonis, in exchange for a significant portion of the young core. On the other, the possibility of building something more organic, betting on emerging pieces like Kai, who can grow alongside a potential redefinition of the team's identity. In the end, the question echoing in the decision-makers' minds is just one. What kind of story do Golden State want to tell in the coming years? The story of a team that panicked and tried to squeeze every last drop out of an era, going all in on expensive, risky moves, or the story of a franchise that had the courage to recognize the end of a cycle and sketch out a new one without abandoning the essence that always made it different? The answer is not tied to a single name. It lies in the vision. Gambling on Sabonis would mean doubling down on the present, accepting certain defensive and spacing limitations in the hope that his offensive talent and playmaking could outweigh the issues. Betting on Kai and on other young players would mean accepting that the road might be a little longer, but with a greater chance of keeping the soul of the team alive. Meanwhile, on the court, the veteran star continues doing what he has always done: shooting, creating, leading, quietly pointing the way. Every well-timed cut, every collective play, every sequence of quick passes that ends in a perfect three-pointer is a reminder of what Golden State once were, and with the right pieces, can still become. It's not about trying to turn back the clock, but about using the past as a compass so as not to get lost in the urgency of the moment. For Kai, the countdown is of a different kind. With every game, every record broken, every night where he dominates the paint and shows improvement in areas that used to be weaknesses, it becomes more obvious that the B-League is just one stage. The basketball world has already noticed. Now, all that's missing is a franchise taking the final step and turning potential into opportunity. Perhaps Golden State's future is not being decided only in a meeting room full of executives discussing numbers, projections, and trades. Perhaps part of that future is being built on courts on the other side of the world, where an Asian center, night after night, proves he is ready for something bigger. And if their paths do cross, it will not be just a signing. It will be an encounter between a team that needs to rediscover its identity and a player who is looking for the perfect stage on which to write the most important chapter of his own story. Whether Golden State choose to risk everything in a huge trade or go for a bolder, more patient bet, nobody knows. What is clear is that the clock will not stop. Every decision, for Sabonis, for Kai, or for some third, as yet unseen route, will define not only the end of this era, but also the beginning of the next. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you really enjoy this kind of analysis and you care about Golden State's future. So here's what you do. Drop a like to support this work, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos, because there is still a lot for us to discuss about the direction of this franchise and about the future of talents like Kai on the NBA stage.